So, so I think the thing that he's really right to point out, in my view, is that this ability for any random person really in the world to have their own channel to reach millions of people is totally unprecedented. And it's actually unprecedented not only technically speaking, but also really from like a regulatory and a legal point of view. If you look historically at America, a place that's always celebrated things like free speech, we've actually always thought about broadcasting really differently than we thought about communication, right? And there's actually two different sort of frameworks. There's sort of the Telecommunications Act that said, hey, if you want to have a phone call with your friend, then you have an expectation of privacy. And actually, you can say pretty wild and outrageous things, but that's sort of your business. But if you want to broadcast those same outrageous or maybe not entirely accurate ideas to millions of people, you're held to a totally different standard. And broadcasters, I'm sure, as you know, because you're on television quite a bit, they're held to a different standard where you can and can't say certain things, you can and can't show certain things. And so I think we're in this weird moment in time where this behavior has been enabled technically, and the regulatory framework actually hasn't caught up to that reality.
Are you suggesting that we need more regulation in your world?
I think what I'm suggesting is we could actually learn a lot from how we've thought about broadcasting in the past and the responsibility of broadcasters. And I think historically we've just said that if you're going to reach a really wide audience and shape the minds and opinions of millions of people, then you do have a responsibility in terms of what you say.
But ultimately, that is a form of regulation, right? I mean, no. If you were a regulator today, if you were in the Trump administration and you wanted to deal with this, what would you do? What is the answer?
For us, I think the answer comes down to identifying really and labeling like what is broadcasting, because I think that is fundamentally the gray area today where we have the challenge. We understand what one-on-one communication is, but if you're let's say your Uncle Joe, for example, has some very extreme and maybe not so accurate views on the world, and he wants to reach 500 people, is that okay? If he wants to reach 50,000 people, is that okay? If he wants to reach 100,000, is that okay? Where do we draw the line in terms of where broadcasting is versus communication with friends?
But that's also the question, which is this whole idea of social media and the internet was supposed to democratize ideas, right? The idea was we were going to get everyone was going to have a voice that they didn't have. And it cuts both ways, because we had this panel just before with Lisa Borders and Padma on Time's Up and Me Too, and they would argue that the Me Too movement couldn't have happened without social media. And some people would argue that that was a very good thing. And then on the other end, there's this political discourse and other pieces of this that have become very complicated, and that's a bad thing. And so how should it work?
Well, I think there are many movements historically that have gotten a lot of traction without social media. So I'm not sure that the movements that we're seeing today, the response to a lot of the inequality that we're seeing in the world today, wouldn't be possible without social media. I think quite the contrary. I think a lot of those movements are really enabled by friends talking to friends, encouraging their friends to come out and make a difference. And I actually think one of the more dangerous things that I've seen is this idea that just using your voice is going to make a big difference, right? That's a piece of it, that's half of it, but the other half is really taking action to implement that change. And so I think today the movements you're seeing that are really successful are the ones that aren't just using their voice on social media, but are really deliberately taking action to make a difference in the world.
You haven't had these issues in the same way, and we'll talk about why on Snap. But what do you think about the kinds of things that you see on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter in this realm?
I don't see too much on Facebook because I'm not on there. I think the challenge really comes down to the way really that social networks evolved into social media. So if we remember, this is 15 years ago now, maybe longer, social networks really came into being because the idea of connecting with people was a new idea, right? You went to college, you made great friends, and then you went off into the world and lived your life, and you lost touch with people. And so it was really exciting to go onto the internet and reconnect with them. And so social networks provided that value. But over time, what happened as smartphones got more and more popular and the internet, really became more like oxygen, right? It was everywhere. That value of reconnecting you with friends wasn't as valuable anymore because you never lost touch with them, right? You just talk to them on the phone all day long. You text message, et cetera. And so what happened was as that value in social networks started to decay and people stopped using social networks to communicate, how they felt or an update about their family, right? For a bunch of different reasons. They did it because the audience on social media was too big and it made them feel uncomfortable. They did it because it was permanent and that also made them feel uncomfortable. But what happened was over time, because there was that vacuum really of personal content and people trying to express themselves, that was filled with media. Right. And so social networks became a vehicle for distributing media, which was a big shift from why they were built in the first place.
Why has this issue not taken place in a meaningful way on Snap yet, you think?
How do you mean?
Meaning that I don't believe, and maybe you are policing it in some meaningful way, the issues that seem to be confronting Facebook, for example, or Twitter, for example, haven't yet jumped to your world. Am I wrong?
Well, I think it would be wrong to treat these problems as some sort of virus or disease, right? These problems are impacting these platforms because they have created an environment where that sort of behavior thrives, right? There's actually a higher propensity of negative content to be shared on these services because negative content has more engagement, right? And so I think you've actually ended up with systems that incentivize negative behavior. And I think if you look at Snap and how we've really thought about content, right, what we identified was that while this shift from social networks to social media was really, really powerful, and the idea of friends organizing content for you was really powerful, it was the first time the internet was personalized, right? Your friends created the newspaper for you every day instead of an editor. What we found was that with the rise of machine learning, computers are actually better at personalizing content for you than your friends. And so if you devise, for example, I think someone who's done this really well is Netflix. If you can define a pool of content that's high quality enough, right, that computers can then rank that content, you can end up with a personalized content experience that doesn't compromise integrity.
Right. Okay, I want to talk about Snap and the Snap business for a moment, because it was on a meteoric rise, I think it's fair to say, but I also think it's fair to say today it is challenged. There were times on this rise, by the way, where Facebook was trying to buy you for $3 billion, and then Google tried to buy you, I think, for $4 billion. There's a report that said Google tried to buy you later for $30 billion. Is that even true?
No comment on that.
No comment? Yeah. It might be true then. No, really, do you want, can you speak to that? Sundar's going to be here in a moment.
It might be better to ask him. I don't know.
I'll let you off there for a second. But let's talk about this. Snap's revenues were better recently than Wall Street had been hoping for, but the losses were lower than expected. But the data on the user base is shrinking. And the question is, what do you think has happened? Is that a product challenge? Is that a product problem? Is that a marketing problem? Is that a generational problem? What do you think has happened in terms of when you look at that number?
So it really, as we look at growth going forward, we're thinking about it really in two ways. So first of all, it's important to understand, like, our core is the 13 to 34 audience effectively in North America and Europe. And that's really our core community and user base where we've grown the service over the past 7 years. And so if we wanted to continue growing the service, we have to grow either in the developing world, right, outside of North America and Europe, where people predominantly use Android, or we have to continue aging up our user base, to be 34 plus, et cetera, in North America and Europe. And so we're thinking about those problems really differently. One of the things that's been a challenge for us for perhaps too long is Android. And Android for us really has been a difficult platform to develop for, and we thought that we could solve the problems we were seeing on Android incrementally. And it turned out about a year, maybe a little more than a year ago, we decided to completely rebuild Android from the ground up. So we're effectively doing 6-7 years of Android product development in 1 year to rebuild the product in a way so it can really perform for users that maybe don't have the top-end Android phones.
But for this to work and to continue to grow, how much of it is about, and by the way, there's some younger people here right in the corner, some students, but how much of it is actually about getting all of us to use Snap in a way that maybe some people here don't?
I think that's a really big part of it. And I think that the first thing we have to do is help people understand the power of visual communication, right? I think a lot of people, when they think about like the most famous writers in the world, right? The best writers in the world can create an image in your mind. That's what makes them so good at what they do. And I think what we have to explain is what Snapchat does is actually, you don't have to be the best writer in the world to create an image in your friend's mind. In one tap, you can, share how you feel, what you're doing, who you're hanging out with. And I think that power in terms of visual communication is something that's just barely getting started.
You made a comment, and I assume this is what you're referring to on your conference call recently,